Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, we have our next SAP Who's Who. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ronald Levant. Thank you for being here. I'm so excited to hear about all of the things that you've done in your career. Why don't you kick us off and tell us about your educational background and professional experience?
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you and Division 29 for doing this and for having me on. So, I have an unusual academic career in a way. I've got two bachelor's degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. One was in history and pre-medicine. I went to med school and that just didn't work out. And the second one, and I decided after I left medical school that I wanted to get a doctorate in clinical psych. And at that time, it was much harder to get into a doctoral program in clinical psych than it was to get into medical school. Much harder. So I went back to Berkeley to essentially take the major in psych. So I earned a second bachelor's degree in psychology. And I got a 4.0 this time, and two-thirds of them were A pluses. And I the Berkeley gives an award to the outstanding undergraduate of the year, and I got it for 1969. There's a plaque in Tolman Hall, and if you look 1969, my name is there. It's not doctor yet, but it's Ronald F. Levant. Um, and from that, I I got into Harvard for graduate school. Now, I should tell you, part of what happened in medical school was kind of my life fell apart. I was married with my daughter Karen, as I mentioned earlier, and uh, my marriage broke up. My first wife moved to New York from San Francisco with my daughter. Um, and So I was motivated, to go to a graduate school on the East Coast so that I could visit, so that I could resume my relationship with my daughter. So that was the reason for going. I had a choice between Harvard and Columbia, and Harvard is so rich. They offered me so much money. Um, it was like uh, tuition, living expenses, books, and they even paid my child support payments.
Okay. Thanks, Harvard.
Yeah, thanks, Harvard. Exactly. And upon graduation from Harvard, I had to do my postdoc year to get licensed, and then I got started my first faculty job at Boston University. And been a professor ever since at different universities. Um, I've been at BU, I've been at Rutgers, I've been at Harvard Medical School. I went to Nova Southeastern University and became the dean of the Center for Psychological Studies. And then I spent 8 years there, and then I left to become the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Akron. And I spent one term as dean and realized, hey, this is hard work, much harder, especially since I was responsible for 19 departments, of which I had knowledge about just one, namely psychology. So I went, when you're when you accept a dean's position, you have an underlying tenured faculty, full professorship in the department of your, you know, that you belong to. So I simply said, I'm not going to go for a second term, finished my 4 years, and then returned to the faculty and stayed on the faculty from 2009 to 2018 when I retired from the university.
That's quite impressive. I'm a Nova Southeastern alum, so thank you for all of the work that you've done to develop a
Oh,
program.
really? Huh.
Yeah,
When did you graduate?
2022. So half my
Okay.
degree was in the middle of the pandemic, so it was quite an experience, but I really enjoyed my time there. Wow, so you've had such a rich educational background and career background. What even inspired you to become a psychologist?
Well, I mentioned I had a rough period there in medical school and with my marriage breaking up. And I also slipped into a major depression, and it lasted about 18 months. And and I was just so disgusted with the inept care that I received. I'll give you one example, and this is only one of many I could give. But I was also a hippie at the time. This was like the 60s, right? I had the hair down to here and the beard and the whole thing. I would say things like far out and out of sight, man.
We
But
need to bring
anyway,
that word back.
what's that?
We
We
need to
have to
bring far out back. Yeah.
Yeah, far out back. So anyway, there was a clinic that was set up for hippies at Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric as part of UCSF medical school. So I went there and enrolled, and the guy had prescribed, the psychiatrist had prescribed various medications, which only made me feel worse. Um, uh, um, and then one day I'm playing ping pong with another member of this daycare, and he wants to talk to me. So I put down my paddle and we sit down. He says, "I'm discharging you." I said, "Why? I haven't gotten any better." And he says, um, "You remind me of parts of myself that I don't like, and I can't treat you, therefore."
Goodness.
Anyway, that was just one of probably a dozen examples of how
Yeah.
bad the care was that I received. So, when I recovered, and I have to tell you how I recovered. I mean, I tried, you know, I tried all kinds of treatments and therapies and whatever medications, and nothing worked. And I have a younger brother, and we were both at Berkeley and wound up staying in Berkeley. And he said, "I'm going to put on an Indian feast, and and you're going to have your first LSD trip," because I hadn't taken LSD. And so he had gotten some LSD from this chemist, Peter Owsley, who was like the hippie chemist who manufactured the best LSD. So, long story short, I took the LSD, had a full-blown LSD experience, and woke up in the morning, and I was no longer depressed.
Wow.
None, none, none.
Yeah.
Before that, depression was like a constant. I went to bed depressed. I dreamed depressed. I woke up depressed. Went through the day depressed, then went back to bed depressed. And it was like that day in and day out. And, suddenly I woke up after, tripping, all night. Um, and I was no longer depressed.
So
And,
powerful.
sort of, and now it's kind of interesting. We're now using psilocybin
Yeah.
to treat treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. So, I didn't take the LSD to treat my depression. It was a happy surprise, but it did. And it was really, and my brother lived in Berkeley and I was living in San Francisco. And I felt like I wanted to get back to Berkeley and get on with my life. So stayed with him and his roommate, who was this well-known poet named Ken Irby. My brother was also a poet. I have to show you his book because I put it together posthumously. He was My brother was an interesting guy. He had gotten arrested during the free speech movement. I don't know if you can see it
Oh, with
because
the background, it's coming in and out, but very cool.
it's called A Poet Drives a Truck. He was a truck driver. He dropped out of Berkeley. He took you know, the licensing class for truck driving, and he never published. He would publish his works in magazines or other people's collected works. So I decided that we were going to publish all of his works, my wife, I, and my daughter, and we ultimately did that. But so anyway, I think we got off the track. Where were we?
I think we were talking about what inspired you to become a psychologist, but it sounds like your own personal experience, which Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that. I think that's a common reason why a lot of people do get into the mental health field, which
Mhm.
actually brings me to my next question. What are some common misconceptions you see in the psychotherapy field?
Well, so I specialize in the psychology of men and masculinity, and I've kind of been in this area since probably the early 1980s, before you were born, I'm sure. And um, and I think one of the most common misconceptions that I've run across is among men who feel that if they're, and men who are having psychological problems, not all men, obviously, but men who are having psychological problems who feel that it would make them less of a man, that it would emasculate them if they were to go into psychotherapy because, they wouldn't be self-reliant and able to solve everything on their own. So, and that's clearly a misconception, as many men who have been treated successfully by psychotherapy, excuse me, can attest.
It's really powerful. So then what would you say is the most rewarding part of your work?
Um, um, let's see. I think probably the most rewarding part of my work as regards psychotherapy was developing a focus on emotionally inexpressive men.
Hmm.
Let me ask you, do you know any men who, when you ask them, they can't tell you what they're feeling?
I'm a military partner, so if that tells you anything, the answer is yes.
Okay. So, I really came into um, an awareness that this was a problem in the 80s when I was running a project at Boston University called the BU Fatherhood Project. Um, give you a little history, or is that, yeah? So, in the early 80s, the men's roles were as fathers were just starting to visibly change. Prior to that, men had very little to do with their kids. For example, a study from the 1960s showed that men increased the amount of time they spent with their children in response to their wives' employment a tenth of an hour a day, 6 minutes. But now, by 82, you were starting to see men holding infants in snuggly packs or pushing strollers in Harvard Square, right? So it's starting to change. So, and at that time, I was, you know, struggling with this role of divorce father. I mentioned I moved back east so I could continue my relationship with my daughter. I would have her live with me during the summers because I was off from school, and I would visit her in New York, on weekends, not every weekend, but periodic weekends, and it just didn't go well. Now, of course, I knew as a psychologist that divorce really has devastating effects on children, especially one that involves a separation, as happened in her case with her mother moving her across the country. I didn't see her for 4 years between the ages of 3 and 7. I saw her twice. Uh, yeah, twice in 4 years. Partly because of my difficulties, and partly, I mean, I just wasn't in a position to get on a plane and fly to New York. Um, and So things were kind of not great, but I kept trying. And then this film came out in 1979, Kramer versus Kramer. Have you heard of that film? It's a film about a couple splitting up with a kid. And uh, Meryl Streep plays Mrs. Kramer, and Dustin Hoffman plays Mr. Kramer. And I saw the film. It came out in 1979, and I had what I call a slow-moving epiphany, meaning it wasn't like flash bang, suddenly realized, but it was over weeks. And I was starting to realize that maybe the situation wasn't that Ron Levant was such a bad father, but that men of my generation really were not well prepared for the role of father or involved father, hands-on parent kind of guy who gets his kids dressed and fed in the morning and off to daycare or school. No, we didn't do any of that. And so I had an opportunity and I created something called the Fatherhood Project, which was designed to help dads learn the skills of parenting. And it was in that context that what we used to do back then is I videotape was very cool in the early 80s, and I had a grant. I bought more video equipment than any sane person would ever want. And it also impressed the men because they'd come into the room and they'd see all this equipment and they'd say, wow, this is cool. And we'd say, we're going to teach you how to be a better dad the same way you might have learned a sport like golf or tennis. You're going to do it. We're going to film it. And then we'll play it back and you'll figure out how to do it better. So in that context, I could see one of the fathers one evening was out of sorts. So I said, is something wrong? And he said, yeah. His son had stood him up for a father-son hockey game. And not knowing anything about men's emotions at the time, I said, well, how did you feel about that? Expecting him to say I was sad or disappointed or upset. He said, he shouldn't have done it like that, with that facial expression and tone of voice. And I said, well, I agree, but again, persisting, how did you feel? He
Right.
looked at me blankly. I said, okay, let's role play this. You play you, and this other father, you play his ex-wife as she delivers the news to him that his son had forgotten about the date. So we do that, we tape it, we play it back, we stop it where his shoulders
Right.
fall and his face goes into a frown. And I'm sitting right next to him, looking at the monitor, saying, look at yourself in the monitor. How did you feel? So he's going like this, scratching his
Yeah.
chin. I guess I must have felt disappointed. I thought to myself, I guess I must have felt disappointed with this much coaching. I wondered, how might a mother feel in an analogous situation, like a daughter standing her up for a shopping date? So this is all going on in my head. Well, at first I was surprised because it's not her, like her to act that way. And then I was hurt that she acted with so little regard for my feelings. Then I was worried that maybe she was upset with me and this is her way of showing it. And then I was disappointed and annoyed because I built my whole day around it and now it was ruined. So I'm thinking, I guess I must have been disappointed, to surprised, hurt, worried, disappointed, annoyed. What's going on here? Turns out I had a faculty meeting later that week. And so I asked for a little time on the agenda. I wanted to ask my colleagues. I was in the counseling psych program there, and they were all psychologists. I said, what's going on here? I explained what happened. They were no help at all. They said, Ron, women are just more emotional by nature. I didn't believe that. So here's what I did. In my doctoral program, I had the option to concentrate in child clinical, which I did. So I knew more about developmental psych than my classmates. And I knew there was an area of research in developmental psychology called emotion socialization. So I went back to that literature, which I had never kind of gone to the primary literature, but I did. And I found some very interesting things. Namely that boys start off life more emotionally expressive than girls as neonates. But neonates don't do much besides cry and sleep. But I found the same finding at 6 months of age when infants do a lot more, and then another one at 1 year of age. So I'm seeing that boys are more emotional than girls. What's going on here? Excuse me. Then at 2, I found a study showing that girls were more verbally expressive of emotions, meaning they use more emotion words than boys. And then between 4 and 6, I found this really ingenious study that showed that boys lose their facial expressivity. What this study did is brought mothers into the lab with one of their children between 4 and 6, a boy or a girl, and the child was shown emotionally stimulating slides while his or her face was videotaped, and the mother watched her child's face in another room on a monitor. And the idea was, can a mother tell the type of slide shown to her child?
Yeah,
4 years of age, mothers were equally accurate with their children, regardless of sex. But as the children aged, they got less and less accurate with their sons.
it's
So
fascinating.
by the age of 6, there were significant differences. So you have to ask, what's going on with boys between 4 and 6? They're in preschool and elementary school, and they're being socialized. Their conformity to the masculine norm of not expressing emotions is being policed by their peers. Their peers are saying, "Oh, you're a baby.
Mhm.
You cry too much," you know, and so the boys are shutting down. And this was like not just one boy, but the however many boys they brought in there, probably 10 or 20. Um, so I'm thinking about, and by the way, just around the same time, I hooked up with Joseph Pleck, who was another psychologist from Harvard. Um, Interestingly, he and I were in different clinical psych programs at Harvard because Harvard has a tradition of killing its clinical psych programs. So he was in the one right before mine, and I was in the next one. So we didn't know each other, but got to know each other. I graduated in 73, so we got to know each other in 80. And I was aware of his work. He wrote this book, The Myth of Masculinity, what really laid the foundation for the psychology of men and masculinities. And I was aware that he talked about masculinity as a set of gender norms.
Hmm.
He put forward the whole idea that children are expected to adopt the stereotypical personality traits of their sex, which he called the gender role identity paradigm. And he said the new paradigm, children are socialized into their gender roles through social learning, reinforcement, punishment, and modeling, right? So children learn boys are supposed to be tough and aggressive, and girls are supposed to be sugar and spice and everything nice. And all that, I mean, have you been in a toy store recently?
Not recently. I don't have children, but I can follow your frame of thought.
Yeah,
We have like
you've
10
got
minutes
this,
left on
you
our
got the pinks and the
date.
blues and the trucks and the shopping cart, that walkers for children made by Fisher Price. For boys are a truck.
Wow.
For girls, guess what?
Shopping cart or
Right, shopping cart.
classic.
So you can see what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
Children are socialized to behave in certain ways. They're reinforced. So here's where I took a leap. I said, this man couldn't put his emotions into words. There are probably a lot of other men like him who were socialized to conform to the masculine norm of restrictive emotionality. And I put forward what I call the normative male alexithymia hypothesis,
Wow.
which is that basic, and the word normative, some people thought it meant frequent. No, it was to refer to the influence of masculine norms. And I set about the next 40 years kind of studying that phenomenon, developing, well, first of all, I did a literature review and a meta-analysis to show that men meet by criteria for alexithymia, you know, more frequently than women. Um, One prevalence study, for example, done in Finland, showed that 10% of men and 7% of women met criteria for alexithymia. So it's more frequent among men. Um, I developed scales to measure it. I developed a manualized treatment for it. I performed a clinical trial on it. I developed, I tried it in my own practice and wrote case studies on it. So, and, I think it's generally accepted now that, one of the things that psychologists like you and I often encounter when you get a man into therapy is he can't tell you what he's feeling. Well, now you have tools to deal with that. And that's in my recently, this is kind of a disclosure. I have to disclose I'm mentioning something, a book for which I expect to receive royalties. So that's a conflict of interest. But I have to say that. But the book, The Assessment and Treatment of Emotionally Inexpressive Men, and it has all the stuff I've mentioned, the theory, the scales, the two versions of the manual, one for individual therapy and one for group therapy, and then two case studies. And the clinical trial as well. So, yeah, so that's the answer to that question.
Wow. You are such a wealth of information. I'm sad that we only get 40 minutes on the Zoom platform to talk. But I guess what is one thing you want our viewers to know for us to wrap up?
What is one thing I want the viewers to know?
For your hope for the field or any of your future plans?
Well, I would say to my viewers who have children or expect to have children, please let your boys be who they are. Please do not force them to conform to the norms of masculinity. Please don't say big boys don't cry. Can I talk about crying for a minute?
We have we have 5 minutes left unless we get kicked out.
All right. Um, that's one of the things that annoys me
Yeah,
most. Big
totally.
boys don't cry because, humans of any sex have tear ducts, right?
Mhm.
And we also know that crying releases hormones, endorphin and oxytocin, that relieve sadness. It actually treats sadness. And so it feels good, it feels good to cry. Um, and finally, if crying were so bad for males, why? Well, let me just say, what is the shortest sentence in the New Testament Bible?
Not sure.
Jesus wept.
Wow.
Hey, if it's okay for Jesus, right?
Right? Yep. That I'm
So,
gonna take that with me. Wow, that is very powerful.
yeah, let your boys be who they are. If your boy is, kind of tough and aggressive, fine, let him do that. If your boy is sweet and kind and likes to take care of his baby sister, let him do that.
Yeah. Just let them be themselves.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming today. The rest of Dr. Levant's interview will be written on our website. And thank you again for taking the time. As I said, you are such a wealth of information. I could probably talk to you for the next like 10 hours. Unfortunately, we only have 40 minutes.
Well, thank
Thank
you
you
so much
again.
for having me, and I look forward to seeing the finished product. And good luck to you.
Thank you. Yes, I will send you everything.
Okay. Bye-bye.